I want to welcome everybody to the Resident and Family Support Council that we hold on the second and the fourth Tuesday of every month. The link that you used to join the meeting today is the same link that we use for every meeting. So keep that in a safe place so you can join us every second and fourth Tuesday of every month at 3 o'clock. We also do post on Facebook what the topics are. So make sure that you like our Facebook page. It's just the Illinois Ombudsman Facebook page. That would be fantastic. Get on, and that way then you'll know what our topics are very easily. If you would also like to be part of our email list and you received the link today, either from a friend or a colleague, you could go ahead and you can email me. We'll make sure I put my email address in the chat so that I can go ahead and I can add you to the invite list. So that way then you'd get those invites in your mailbox every other week. As a reminder, we do record these meetings and they get posted onto YouTube. So I do know it can be difficult sometimes for people to get to these meetings in the middle of the day. So know that you can always watch these at nighttime, on the weekends, or even just listen to them when you're in the car driving. All you need to do is go to our YouTube page, which is IL Ombudsman on YouTube, and you'll be able to access these meetings. We have over 40 meetings right now, which is really, really a cool thing to have. And there's such a variety of topics. And we really do get a lot of compliments on the different types of topics that are out there so that people can really feel more empowered with their long-term care, trying to navigate this path. And that's the purpose of these meetings. The purpose is to really make sure that people do feel empowered with information, so that you can feel like you know how to be able to navigate what's going on in a long-term care environment that you may find yourself or your loved one in. It can be very intimidating because we don't know what we don't know. So that's why we try to be able to provide as much information as we possibly can during these meetings. And like I said, we do it on a variety of different topics, and sometimes the topics can be a little hard, like today's topic. We're talking today about person-centered end-of-life care. I know not all of us, we don't think sometimes about the end of our life, but the older we get, if we have a sickness that comes into play, we do start thinking about this. And it's a natural part of conversation. We need to start bringing this in so we can do a better job and be able to plan for what this looks like so it can be person-centered and person-directed. So to lead us in this conversation today, we invited Nancy. Nancy Flowers. Nancy, you want to go ahead and open up your microphone a little bit? Could you tell us a little bit about who you are and how you wound up on this path of helping people make these person-centered end-of-life decisions?
Thank you very much for inviting me today. I actually became interested in this as a young nurse's aide when I was 18. And getting ready to start college, and read about this very new concept that was originated in England, which was the hospice movement. We've always cared for the dying, but as I was caring for people at the end of their lives, I became interested in how we could do this better. And so it became kind of a quest in every single job I had, was how we could care better for our neighbors, our elders, our parents. So,
well, it is such, we don't like to think about this. We don't want to think about when our life ends. But if we don't think about it and we don't think about it well, it may not look like how we want it to look. I know when you ask people, how do you want your life to end? When you die, what do you want that to look like? And most people say, I want to die in my sleep, right? Mm-hmm. But it doesn't turn out that way many times. So if you could share a little bit about what this person-centered end of life, what does that really mean?
The hospice movement itself, and I want to talk a little bit about that as well, is really I think a nice epitome of person-centered care. The focus is on on how to help individuals and their families, because this is an area of healthcare where we think in terms of a family unit, how to help them have the best possible care they can, so that they're comfortable, that we support their ability to live well until they die. The focus is not on helping the people the person die quicker. It really is on helping manage symptoms, manage anxiety. The concept that the the originator of the modern hospice movement, if you will, Dr. Dame Cecily Saunders, came up with is the idea that there's really three types of pain when you talk about total pain management, that there's certainly physical pain, but we're also addressing the psychosocial needs of a person and their family and the spiritual needs of the person and family. And so what end-of-life care looks like in hospice is a comprehensive team of people that focus on addressing those needs. There is an assumption that no one person can do that, that you really need the talent of a full team, of a physician, a nurse, a social worker, a chaplain, a home health aide, volunteers. Some hospices have music and massage therapy. But the idea is that you have a specially trained group of people whose focus is on addressing all the different types of fears, anxieties, pain, distress that can come up in as we approach end of life. That is certainly something that I think every area of healthcare ought to be addressing. Certainly something that I've done a lot of teaching as I progressed through, my career and spent 12 years as a manager at a large nonprofit hospice. But and certainly in my work now in cancer care, the focus on what does quality of life mean to each of us and how we make decisions about what that looks like for ourselves, or if we're caring for someone who has lost the capacity to tell us what that means to them, how do we raise that for them and make sure they get that type of care? So it's really, it's very consistent with person-centered care because that is the focus and it's the focus on what each individual identifies as what's important to them. What does quality of life look like for you may be different than for me, probably not, but it may be. And so how do we make sure that we're addressing that all along the care continuum?
And that is, so much of what we talk about during these meetings leads us to this statement of this person-centered, person-directed care, that concept. Can you talk to what just in general, what that means? Can you kind of tell us what that means?
Yes, I am thinking back to ombudsman meetings because I was a regional ombudsman, as some of the people on this call may know, for 12 years. But the focus on care, the care that's important to me as a human being, as an individual. What do I want for each of us when we get up in the morning? There's a certain amount of that. We get to pick when we're going to get up. We're going to pick the jobs we're going to have. We pick the families we're going to be in. We pick where we want to live and how we want to be treated. We have a fair amount of autonomy around that. Person-centered care, in my mind, is really looking at ways to replicate that for a person, that the person's voice is carried forward in their care, whether that's they're living independently in the community, they're living in an independent setting of a life plan community, or they're at the end of their life with advanced dementia in a nursing home. How do we help that voice come forward? How do we help make sure that the care that they receive is individualized for them? I have just completed probably about a 10-year journey with a friend of mine who was living in a long-term care facility in a life plan community. And part of my role every day that I visited her was making sure that her preferences were heard, that she was not just seen as a person with dementia, but as a human being that had a past, that had been an English teacher, that was a mother, was a social worker, was a boss, my boss. That care that she received was unique and specific to her. And that's a challenge in healthcare because we were not born to do that. We were set up to provide care to large groups of people, whether it was in a hospital or a nursing home. But each of us on this call today has the opportunity to be the voice for somebody else. And that's, I suspect, why you're on today, is learning how to do that, how to identify the resources that help you do that, so that person you love who's in a care facility, or if you are yourself in a facility, make sure that the care you receive is specific and unique to you.
So I'm hearing you say that that person-centered care is really listening to the voice of an
Yes.
individual.
Yes,
So we
or
listen to-
speaking for the voice if that person has lost capacity.
Okay, and that's where I was leading to. So how do I do this if the person can't communicate that anymore? How do I find out what they want?
That is a beautiful question. And I was thinking about that a lot today, because many of us earlier in our healthcare may very well have sat down with someone. And I know your last discussion was on advanced care planning and powers of attorney. And
Mhm.
certainly the ideal is that we have these conversations while we all have capacity. I have some pretty wonderful and sometimes hilarious memories of having them with both of my parents and my aunt, who I was power of attorney for all three of those folks, about what was important to them, so that when they lost the ability to speak, I could speak for them. But finding out what kind of care they wanted, what was important to them as a person, and as illness has affected my parents and as my aunt, what was important to them. There's actually, the Mayo Clinic has a beautiful advanced care planning document that lays out questions about what quality of life means to you. And it includes examples. You know, if you're in a wheelchair, if you've lost the ability to speak, if you've lost the ability to direct your care, is that quality of life for you? For some of us, that might still be, depending on how we were living and cared for. For others of us, it might not be. So doing that with each of my parents and my aunt helped me know what they wanted when my parents lost the ability to speak. My aunt is still mercifully, wonderfully able to tell me what she wants, but still having those conversations about the what ifs. What if your heart stops? What if you stop breathing? What if you have advanced dementia and you're no longer able to do something? How do you feel about being rehospitalized? I mean, all of the what ifs that are really hard often to talk about, but I would encourage you all, if you could, to have those conversations. If someone's lost capacity and you haven't been able to have that conversation, or maybe they never wrote down what they wanted, thinking back about maybe conversations you've had, what seems important, because we're never going to have conversations about every single hypothetical that might come up. That's kind of I think, scary part for many people is, what if I do the wrong thing? What if I guess wrong? So what you're going to do is a combination of, what do I think mom or dad or my sister or my brother or my aunt might have wanted? How did they live? What seemed important to them when they were younger? And then really making sure that the medical team that you have around your relatives and around you are answering your questions. I do a lot of advanced care planning discussions, have for years since I was in probably my late 20s. I had to learn to have hard conversations with adults when I was very young, and had to get brave about it and figure out ways to invite people to tell me their worries, their fears, their preferences. I've also cared for people with dementia in my family and friend circle, and have had to think about conversations we had as well as what they wrote down. But when I'm doing advanced care planning right now, I often will help people identify what are their worries and questions about care. I deal with cancer patients right now, many of whom are very frightened about what's going to happen to them, and helping them identify the benefits and burdens of care, what it means, what is something they didn't think they could handle, and what is something they can tolerate to get to a greater goal. Helps them in asking questions of their physicians. We'll sit and talk about what information they need from their physician in order to make a decision. I would argue that that's the same thing a caregiver
Mhm.
Attorney needs to be able to do is to identify, if you're asked to do, say, put a feeding tube in someone, will that help them? Will that prolong their life? Will it benefit them? Will it reduce the risk of aspiration or not? Give me the information I need in order to make an informed decision. If someone is repeatedly going to the hospital and you're wondering if it's helpful, ask that question. Ask if this is going to benefit this person, add to the quality of their life, or is it extending what seems to be suffering? Those are the kinds of questions we as caregivers really need to be able to know in order to make decisions. And I find, even though I've been doing this since I was literally 18, I've been caring for people in some capacity or another in multiple healthcare settings. When it's my mom, my dad, my aunt, my dear friend, I'm as vulnerable and need guidance and help. I may know stuff, but I still need that guidance from a physician. Is this going to be helpful? Is it not?
You
Is
know,
it?
it does, there is times when, just from personal stories or stories that I hear in the professional path, I feel that many of us are very physician driven.
Yeah.
We go to the doctor says, take this pill, we take this pill. We don't even sometimes know what the pill is for, but the doctor told me to take it, so I better take it. I have a funny story about my mother that was having some stomach issues, and we were on our way going out of town. She had gone to the doctor that morning. She goes to the doctor gives her a prescription for something. We had to stop at Walgreens on the way to the airport to make sure that she could get her prescription. She goes to the pharmacist, she hands the thing to the pharmacist is like, that's in aisle 5. He just gave her an antacid, and the doctor wrote it on her prescription pad, not as a prescription, but just the name of it. But my mother went right to the doctor, told me, I need to have this. I have to have it now. I think sometimes it's generational. I also think sometimes it's personality wise, the authoritative figure is telling me to do this. So this is where, when it comes to this end of life, one of my biggest, you said getting brave about the conversation, which I loved the way you put that. I think this is why many of us are on this call right now, is we're not brave. I don't even know how to enter into this conversation with my loved one, because I don't want to be talking about you dying, because I don't want you to think I want you to die. And I don't want you to, I'm not pushing it. I want to know, but I don't want to make you sad. And how do we even just start this whole thing, Nancy?
That is a wonderful part of it, is because I think many of us are exactly experience that we're hesitant. If we bring it up, are they going to think I think they're going to die, or that I want them to die? And what I think is really important is to ask about worries, ask about things. For example, I have my funny stories too, but I was at my mom, as my dad was as was dying, we actually had very frank conversations about his health. He had a series of rare disorders over his life. And part of we spent the 7 months he was on hospice talking about his worries, his fears, how he wanted to die, how he wanted to live until he died. It was perhaps the most amazing journey I've ever been on. It was, instead of Tuesdays with Maury, it was Saturdays with Floyd. But I had a really clear sense of what he wanted as his health declined. When my mom, after he died, my mom had not had any advance directives completed. My dad actually surprised me by making me his backup power of attorney without telling me, which by the way, you always want to tell your power of attorney if you've chosen them. But my mom's conversations with me were really quite wonderful, as the facility was asking her, now that she was living alone, who would be her designated decision maker should she ever lose capacity. And more to the point, they apparently she felt like chasing her around with a do not resuscitate form, and she wanted to know why. So we sat and went through both of them. I probably spent about an hour and a half with her, walking through the power of attorney and what she wanted, and more to the point, what she wanted me to do as her voice when she lost capacity. But the DNR was, and that was a great conversation. I had a really clear sense. We talked through everything from, what quality of life looked like for her to, where did she want to be at end of life, which is really helpful guidance to me. The power of it, the do not resuscitate form, the POLST, was, there were moments of almost hilarity in it. And I don't say that with disrespect. My mother was a retired nurse trained at the Mayo Clinic, smart woman, but she's looking at this form and she says, well, if I pass out, I want to be revived. And so that was an important clarification. If you pass out, you of course will revive. This form really, is about if they find her dead in her apartment, does she want them to attempt to resuscitate her? If her heart stops, she stops breathing. And what was incredibly helpful was that conversation, because she looked at me and I said, Mom, if they find you on the floor and it's been 5 hours, what do you want them to do? And she said, good God, nothing. But so we then went back sort of over that. We started talking about things that are hard to talk about, like intubation and what resuscitation looks like. And I can talk about this, I recognize, because I've worked in healthcare forever. But if I hadn't been comfortable, I would have said, how about if we set up a time to meet with your doctor? Because my mother at that moment, even though her brain was really good and physically she was pretty good shape, she also had chronic pulmonary, COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So she was going to gradually decline. And the likelihood that if she stopped breathing, putting her on a vent was not going to save her life, would prolong it. And I wanted to know what she wanted me to do at that point. And that conversation, just sitting and chatting about, and we were sitting there drinking coffee and chatting about her future and what was important to her and what she wanted me to do, was a real gift to me. As a professional, I have these conversations literally every day. And I ask people about what is important to them. I do ask them during the first time I meet them toward the end of the interview, if they've done advanced care planning documents. And I normalize it by saying that I think everyone over the age of 18 should have them, which I do think that. And then we start to talk about what's important to them. If they don't have them, would they like some help in completing them? But during that conversation, it is, again, I separate it out from the cancer or whatever health issue they have and focus on what's important to them. What do they want their families to know about their care preferences? There's a beautiful online resource, the Conversation Project, which I'd recommend everyone look at because it is full of tips on how to begin those conversations. And contrary to the ads you sometimes see about having it over Thanksgiving dinner, I don't recommend that. That's for turkey and eating good food. But having a low-key conversation with somebody you care about, like I did with my mom, like I did with my dad, like I've had with my aunt and other friends, is a gift to them. Thank you for the link. Is a gift, because what we can do is begin to talk about this in a time that's non-crisis. My aunt and I ended up having her conversation in the intensive care unit. Not a way I'd recommend, but it worked fine because I got a call one day that she was in the hospital. She was in Minnesota. I was in Illinois, needed to run up there. So I didn't really have a chance to pre-plan this. I'm also, up until that point, maybe saw her twice a year. It's a lot more now that I have a different job for her. But we spent time in the intensive care unit with the help of a palliative care physician. I'm going to talk a little bit about them, talking through how her health was and how she understood her health. So that is another way to do this, is rather than tell people, Mom, you're sick and you need to do this, is to begin to invite the person you're worried about, how they view their health.
Could we just stop
Totally
there for a minute so that I could
understandable.
just to elaborate on that? Because I think that's something that I don't think a lot of us have heard. That's a great question to ask people. And that might even be a great leading question, is just how do you view your future?
Yes. Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah,
this is what's going on in my world, and maybe do a little personal sharing yourself,
yeah,
and what I
yeah,
want.
yeah,
And how do you view your health right now? Because there are some people, they might have a diagnosis, but they may still feel very, very healthy.
yeah.
And there's
And
other
often
people,
they are. Yeah.
and other people may have a diagnosis and they may feel very, 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 very sick. And so it just the way it hits people can be very different. So I think that that's I want to make sure that people just hear that. How do you understand your health?
Yeah.
Great
And
question.
what are your worries? There's another great resource is Atul Gawande's Being Mortal, which talks about, he's a physician, a surgeon actually, who writes about how our healthcare industry, we don't train our staff really well on how to do this as well as we should. And this is a book about his journey. And there's actually a great companion Frontline episode that I recommend. And if you ever want to show it, I own it. But it's terrific. And part of what they do in both, what he talks about is asking the question, what's important to you right now? To think about how you look at your life and what you want other people to know about what's important to you.
Mhm.
And those are really simple questions that invite a pretty lovely conversation.
Yeah, because I mean, just looking at again my sister-in-law and her father when he got sick and he was in the hospital, and the doctor wanted to put a feeding tube in for her, and she never had this conversation with her father at all. But she knew who her father was, and her mother had MS, and her father watched her mother die, and was the primary caregiver, and said, I never want to go through any of that. I don't want anything, but it was never documented, and it was said fairly quickly. It wasn't an engaged conversation. So when the feeding tube came up, the doctor's like to my sister-in-law, we want to put a feeding tube in. And my sister-in-law was like, my dad, I don't think really wants that. And he's perfectly cognitive and could give an answer.
Mhm.
And he's like, I don't want it. And the doctor's like, that's the only thing you're going to do to be able to survive. So you need to have a feeding tube. And he's saying, and your daughter gets to make the decision now, which is so wrong. So I want to
Also not accurate if he's
yes.
competent.
And so I want to encourage people to look at the session we had last time. Our last meeting 2 weeks ago was on advanced directives. So please go back and look at that session for information on making sure you have your advanced directives in place, and a power of attorney. If the person can vocalize and give their choices, the power of attorney does not kick in yet. It only
It
kicks
does not kick in until the person loses capacity, or they direct their agent to make decisions for them. But they do not lose capacity. They can't be outvoted just because the healthcare team doesn't like the decision making. And that,
yeah. And my sister-in-law they put the feeding tube in because he made my sister-in-law the doctor made my sister-in-law feel so guilty if she didn't do it. And then her brother came in, and her brother's like, what are we doing? We know this isn't what dad wants. Why is this happening? He doesn't want to, this is not what life looks like for him. And they did wind up getting it removed, but it was just strife that no one needed to go through. If it would have been, that conversation would have really been documented better. And I'm not belittling my sister-in-law in any way, shape, or form, but also if the doctor didn't put pressure, you got to listen to what people want. The doctor didn't know my father.
Yeah. And the other thing that can happen if you find yourself in a scenario like this, and you may, I have a number of ombudsman stories that are flooding back to me about feeding tubes going in really without minimal consent on the part of family or patient, is to ask the question, because that will stop the conversation for a moment, is to tell me more about why this is needed right now.
Oh.
Tell me more. So you can stop the conversation. And if the patient and family disagree with the care team, you have several rights. You can change care teams. You can also ask for, particularly if it's a hospital, an ethics consult. You can ask for, but you can slow it or stop it by saying, tell me more. It is possible with additional information, perhaps you might have heard something that might change your mind, but it also could be after that to say, no, that's, that you're, you know, the patient in this case might have said, I still don't want that.
Mhm.
Um, and feeding tends to be a very emotional thing. It is, often families find themselves making this decision as much as your sister-in-law did in a crisis moment,
Yes.
which is why it's really helpful to have that conversation earlier, even if it's hypothetical. That question actually in a feeding tube is on the POLST form, the DNR form. And I find it helpful to ask families, do you have an opinion on this right now? I'm,
Mhm.
may not, but, is this something either you or your family has had any kind of, absolutely, I don't want that, which then
Mhm.
allows us to write that down in a non-crisis time. And exactly to your point, perhaps prevents unnecessary interventions being done.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no
it's,
need
yeah.
that extra additional stress when you're dealing with your loved one declining in health and get pressure from it. If we can, I'm just hearing so much is this conversation. Conversation is so important, and it just keeps bringing me back to, I'm blessed because my mother's a social worker,
Mhm.
and so
Excellent.
we have
Excellent.
yes, so we have had conversations, but there's so many people when I say
Mhm.
this to I have so many friends going through this now, and I'm like, what does your mother want? What does your father want? And they're like, we've never talked about it. I'm like, I know this is difficult because your father's always been the strong man in the family, and now he's getting weaker. But you need to have a conversation because it's only going to put a lot of question marks in your head. And
It's a gift. I see, and what I say to the people that I counsel is I refer to it as a gift for their family. Because what
Mhm.
you're doing is not only identifying who's going to speak for you, which can cut down a lot of conflict at the bedside. It can add just, depending on the family, but it can clarify it. But the other is you're communicating your wishes.
Mhm.
The other thing that we can do, I think, and this really came to for with a 97-year-old friend of mine who had dementia, is to have backups to the power of attorney, but to also have a support team helping make decisions. This friend of mine who had been my mentor when I was a brand spanking new grad, so I've known her for 40 some years, knew a lot about her and what was important to her, and became very involved in helping her family navigate her dementia, which is very hard for them. And then also through her dying, helped them pick a hospice, helped them understand what they were looking at, did a lot of teaching with them. This is my dear friend. But one of the things that we found really helpful was to be able to brainstorm together. What would our friend want? What would their mother want? What would my friend want? And to help support decision making. We had one incident, her beautiful care in the facility she was in, absolutely beautiful care. I cannot say enough good things about. One tiny thing that could have derailed a lot. The week she was dying, they found a bruise on her leg. Not intentional. There's no way in any God and green earth that I believe it was intentional. And having been a former ombudsman, I know how to look for signs of other things. Um, they did a portable x-ray, found that there was no misalignment. So we just asked them to really to immobilize her leg a bit, make sure she was comfortable. She was imminent. She was going to be dying soon. We did not want anything else done, no hospital trips, no nothing. We were very comfortable on that. We got challenged by not the team at the bedside and not the director of nursing, but this organization had become part of a larger organization, and their corporate people challenged it. They wanted her to go to the emergency room. They wanted her to see an orthopedist. They kept saying, well, we don't know that she doesn't need surgery. And um, the daughter and I framed what we wanted to say, and she sent me in to have the conversation with the administrator and the team to say, this woman is dying. She is comfortable. And the daughter even found herself saying, I'm not going to sue you. But together, we as a team finally got them to hear the word she's dying, and we don't want to do anything else. And we're okay with that.
Mhm.
And more to the point, that was her choice. All of her directives were very clear. I am very pleased to tell you that she died comfortably in that bed, did not go to the emergency room, did not go to see an orthopedist. That would have been interesting.
Yeah.
She was able to die in the bed, surrounded by her family, but also surrounded by the caregivers that have been taking care of her for years. But I cannot tell you the amount of distress that caused, having been on that side of the bed and having to say to people I've known for years, what are you doing?
Mhm.
So I want to encourage you, you are the voice. And there's, you know, and I so appreciated that when I was on the ombudsman side of this, and I felt it very powerfully as I was advocating for my friend to be able to die in her bed and not to be hauled off in an ambulance to go see somebody to get no treatment.
Yeah.
So
We need to assert, and the message there is, don't stop, don't concede just because a power that be is saying do it. Do
yes.
it. Just stick to what the person wants.
Mhm.
Excuse me.
It's very, it's really, we are their voice. And my job as a clinician is to help people feel comfortable talking about what they want communicated to others. And sometimes to even train family members how to be that voice. Um, it's critical in the world you're working in.
And since you brought this up, if I live in a long-term care facility, what should hospice look like? Who cares for me? Is it still the staff in the building? Is it the hospice staff? Who is it? And do I stay in my own room?
Oh,
What
it's absolutely beautiful. So the fact is that in most facilities, if you're talking in a facility, the care is going to happen in the room you're in. Some facilities have actually developed rooms that they may move people to as they get closer to end of life. Some facilities call them chrysalis rooms, but for the most part, people are going to stay in their home just that they would. 90% of people who die in hospice die in the setting they've been living in, whether that's in their nursing home or at home. During COVID, some people went home because facilities could not allow families in as much as they should have. And I know that many of you may have lived through some of those horrors. I was doing a lot of video chats with my friend for a year and a half. But people, when hospice comes in, you have the opportunity to meet with and interview the hospice. And again, hospice is a partner, a support team to those that are caring for the person, whether they're at home or in a care facility. So they support the team, they educate the team, they consult with the team. They're paid essentially by Medicare to care manage the care of the person, making sure they're on the right medications to keep them comfortable. If they're having shortness of breath, making sure that they have oxygen and the medications to help ease that shortness of breath. Whatever the symptoms are, that's their specialty, is managing those symptoms and providing that information to the facility staff so they can then administer those medications as prescribed. The other thing that's really terrific about hospice is that in addition to, you know, they'll come, most of their regular visits are going to be during regular business hours. But if there is a crisis, if the person is approaching end of life, or they have more symptoms that are breakthrough symptoms, and there's a need on a weekend, on a holiday, in the middle of the night, they have staff on call 24 hours that can certainly talk to the facility staff by phone and guide them, because it may just be increase this medication, give more, increase this, or we're going to order this and you're going to give this more often. Or you are, or they may come out themselves. There were several times that I asked because I know the regs, having been a hospice manager, and I'm still involved with the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization. I asked for more frequent visits, particularly when she was getting closer to end of life. I asked for that because I thought the facility staff needed it. They were struggling, just as we grieve for the person that's dying that we love. In this particular case, these staff members had cared for my friend for years. They loved her. And I'm not exaggerating. I'm not being Pollyanna. They loved her. They were so sad that she was less and less conscious, so they couldn't feed her more. They had this hope that, just like families, if I could feed her a little more, she'd live. And the fact was, she was very quietly and peacefully dying. And so I asked for the staff to come more often. Yeah, it was nice to see them and to be comforted by them. These were people I'd known for a long time, but I wanted them to comfort the staff. And actually, I asked for the staff to reach out to the facility staff after my friend's death to help them mourn and help them grieve.
And I think that's a beautiful part of what hospice can also offer. It's not just for the person who's dying, it's also for those that are living.
It's absolutely, and there's bereavement services for families afterwards, because even if we anticipated the death, even as with my friend, she was 97 and a half. That's a pretty good run. And she had, her dementia was kind. Her dementia was more pleasant than not. So she was beloved. Not a bad thing. And she was beloved for when she was there for my kids and me and her daughters and all of us. But the bereavement is still, even if I'm grateful she did not suffer, I'm grateful that she had this good run, it's still it's still comforting to get a call from the bereavement staff of the hospice to say, how are you doing today?
Yeah, so
And what do you need?
You can get hospice services. I just want to clarify, because there was a question in the chat. Can you have hospice service care in an apartment that's part of an assisted living facility? Or
you can get it anywhere, in independent living, in assisted living. I actually worked on the assisted living regs when I was an ombudsman to make sure that people could get home care and hospice in assisted living. I don't claim other parts of the regs, but I do claim that. But you can get hospice care if people are in the hospital and too fragile to be moved. They can get hospice care. And if people are very symptomatic and need to be in a higher level of care to manage their symptoms, they may be moved either to an inpatient unit that's run by the hospice or a hospital setting, depending on the hospice and the resources they have. But you can get care wherever the person lives. The hospice I worked for had even done care in a homeless shelter at one point, because that's where the patient lived. We got them out of there, but we started their care in the shelter. So it is wherever you call home, that's where care can be provided.
And I actually worked for a long-term care facility group that actually they did the chrysalis rooms. Loretta Downs is a person we can attribute those to a chrysalis room. It comes from the butterfly. That's the butterfly, the cocoon that the butterfly, and the process that the butterfly goes through. And she actually was somebody who's in the business world, and her mother was dying in this long-term care facility. And she asked for what she wanted for her mother. The facility gave it to her, and she started doing. After her mother died, she said the tribute to her mother was to take what she knows she needed and help comforted her mother to create an environment for others. And she just started, she left the business world and actually started focusing in on end of life. So this was something that was not in her wheelhouse, but because of
but it's been a beautiful mission. And I know Loretta well. But one of the things, and where that becomes most critical, is if you're in a facility with a shared room. And family is visiting more, patient needs, maybe more serene environment. It's not necessarily a fair thing for either the roommate or the patient. And so to have a separate room to go to, many facilities, they may not do specifically chrysalis room, but they may move the person to a private room or to make the room private so that they have that. In facilities that obviously have where the person's in a private room, how nice for them to stay in their room and have it be the way they want it. We had a slumber party at my friend's room the night before she died because I just knew that and because I did this work, I knew she was dying. So I had prearranged with the director of nursing that whenever that time came, we'd be camping out. And so her daughter and I had our mattresses in the room and spent the night with my friend and were there when she died. And that is something that you too can ask for, is to
Mhm.
be present if that's something that's important to you. To be able to be close to your relative. When my mother was in a hospital setting on hospice, they thought she was too fragile to move, and so they kept her in. My brothers and I made it party central. We toasted her. We had dinner with her, even though she couldn't eat and wasn't awake, but we celebrated her life. And so
That's
I would, yeah, it's really, certainly that's how I grieve. That's what's
and
important to me.
and if you're
And
a
that's
long-term
important.
care
It's finding
facility,
what you want. Yeah.
yeah, and if you're at a long-term care facility or you have a loved one in a long-term care facility, encourage them and ask, excuse me, I'm sorry about that. And ask for, if your loved one is approaching end of life, ask for these types of things. Got communication, make sure there's a Karen, one of our work group members, dropped in the information about the chrysalis room. She's been dropping in stuff all along. So look at some of those links that you're going to find in the chat right now to help you. I know facilities have done hospice carts where in the cart
Yes.
it might have some, just even some, a sound machine or some calming music or some literature. They bring in coffee and cookies 24 hours a day for the
Yep.
families so that the families can feel comforted as well. So they don't have to leave. They can be right there. And they also encourage the same organization that actually the chrysalis room started at. They encourage staff to come by and say their goodbyes, as long as that was the family wanted that, and the family, Loretta did want that for her mother. So the residents, the residents as well, the residents and staff were coming in and saying their goodbyes as well. So it became such a beautiful, wonderful end of life for her mother. And that's what we all, we say we want to die in our sleep, but dying in your sleep, that's one, if we can all accomplish that, go for it, but we can't plan it. So, but this we can plan. Everything we're talking about right now, we can plan. We can plan for those conversations. We can plan for talking to the facilities about this stuff. If you don't see your loved one, or you don't feel you're ever going to move out of that facility, this is where your life will be ending. Talk to them about that now. What will end of life look like for me? What will end of life look like for the other residents? What will it look like for my loved one? Let's talk about this and get something happening so it looks beautiful. It doesn't go out the back door when somebody dies.
Well, and there are many, and to your point, there are many facilities doing this. And when I did training in facilities around this, we would talk about the different things they could do. I've been in facilities where people go out very much the front door with residents, saying their goodbyes, chimes being run. I was at a facility to do a death call a number of years ago when I was in hospice, and the facility was predominantly Jewish, and we sat Shiva. And people came, it was a husband and wife that shared a room, and the husband who had been our patient had died. And they gave us a room, they gave us coffee and refreshments, and people came in one at a time to pay respect to the widow. It was gorgeous. I think facilities, many are beginning to do this or have been doing this for some time. But it's, yes, what is the tradition that would be important to you all? What would your relative want? What would be comforting to you? And so people came in when I was with my friend, and I talk about this because it was very recent, just a month ago. People came in to say goodbye to her. People came in to honor us. People fed us. The facility took care of us. What a beautiful way. And that is what I will remember. And not the hiccup with the fracture. I mean, I will remember the care because
Joyce,
everything else was so good.
one of our participants put into the, and I don't know, Joyce, if you want to unmute yourself and tell the story personally, you talk about a community that had you clear the room out because of an impending death. and the resident wasn't returning to the community. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself. If you do, please feel free. But the room had to be cleared out today or the resident would be charged another month. And the residents, I know, and the family had been there 2 years and gave multiple donations to the community. That is not the way a death should look.
No, no,
that's
and I am
opposite.
so
Joyce,
very
thank you for
sorry.
sharing that. Yes.
Yeah, I'm so very sorry for that, as opposed to we had plenty of time. We did not have to do the clearing out of the room after my friend died. We had, I think many facilities, I mean, depending, I cleaned out my parents' apartment. Actually, they were funny. They said, take as long as you want. We'll charge you, but take as long. But we had a month. My friend, they were the facility, she was the life plan community she was in, very generous about time because we needed time to grieve. But that's yeah, not
And
good.
I guess really think what Joyce wrote here is fairly common. It becomes,
Yeah.
I think the facilities are just as uncomfortable with death
So
as
can I
people are.
Can I speak to that? Because thank you for bringing that up. So it's the question of how long a body can be in the bed after death is a really important one. Facilities are very uncomfortable and will often say they need to get out of here quick. And we would get calls in the middle of the night, like, get out here, get them out of here. We need funeral home to take them, get them out of here. Nothing bad is going to happen with that body if that body is in that bed for a while. And I don't mean days, I mean it can be there. Public health is not prescriptive about this in Cook County. If those of you in King County, there's a 4-hour requirement to get the body moved. But and I talked to the coroner and said the family needs more time to gather at the bedside. They'd go, okay, fine, just let us know when they're removed. So some of it, if you are in a county that's more restrictive, asking for more time, they're fine. They just want to make sure the body isn't left there. But the fact is, nothing horrible is going to happen if people need a little more time to grieve at the bedside. But I know facilities do get nervous. They get uncomfortable. If there's a roommate, I can understand that a little bit because you've inconvenienced a roommate who may themselves be grieving. And when I've done death support calls in the past, I've actually spent time with the roommate if they're in the room too, because this is their friend who's died. So they need support. But if anyone tells you got to move lickety split, I was thinking belongings, but I wanted to comment on the body being removed by the funeral home. You have some time for family to gather if you want to gather at the bedside before the body's removed. And if you need resources on that, I'm happy to share that. I've done a ton of research on that and know what the counties around us say. Most actually don't require the body to be removed right away. So if people need a little time to say goodbye, they can have it.
And that's very good to hear because I don't know what those rules are. So I'm glad to hear that somebody's done that research for us.
I have, because we got pushback. Yeah, you don't take the ombudsman out of the girl. And so you just don't. And so that was something that I did a lot of research on when I was at the hospice I was working at, was to make sure that our staff knew what they could communicate to families. And I often was the one dealing with the coroner to make sure we weren't going to get any pushback.
That's really good. And I want to just encourage anybody, if you would like to unmute your phone, please do go ahead and feel free to ask any questions. I know, Nancy and I could be talking for hours. I think as the people that we are, especially about a topic that has so much change that needs to happen to make it more person-centered in long-term care. It needs to happen, and it could only happen through all of us asking for it to happen. Stephen, do you have a comment that you'd like to share?
Really, I'm chiming in for the time check.
Okay.
It's 3:55.
Okay, thank you. Well, and so I want to just kind of some things that I heard, Nancy, that I want to make sure that just really get heard. So things that you said that were like very poignant things for me personally. To ask about those what ifs. when you're planning what that end of life is going to look like for yourself. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if you just have a fall and you're laying on the ground for 5 minutes? What if you have a fall and you pass out just for a little bit? What sort of things do you really want? Those what ifs, really important. If the person loses their voice and they can't tell you, and you didn't have any conversation about this, so many people wound up in that situation, to really make sure that you look at who they were in their past and help make that be the guide, not for what you want, because many of us don't want to lose that person that we love. We've got to think about what it is that they want, make it person-centered for them, and make it those beautiful stories that we heard from Nancy. Make the death just as beautiful as their life. Really focus in on that. And being brave about having this conversation. If you haven't talked to anybody about what you want at the end of your life, or if you haven't talked to the person that you're a power of attorney of, or somebody that you love, that you know you're going to be involved at the end of their life, be brave. Have the conversation. Have coffee together. Have a moment where you can have that beautiful conversation that Nancy shared she was able to have with her mother. And then also another really great questions to ask somebody to start this conversation is, how do you understand your health to be? And what are your worries? What do you want for your future? What is it that you're looking at? What do you feel your health condition is? Talking about that stuff. And then if you get pushback from somebody about why they want to give you a feeding tube, your loved one, you don't want to give your loved one the feeding tube, you don't think it's something that they would want, because they've lost their voice, so they can't articulate it. Really, tell me more about why that is needed right now. That I think is so important, to question that authoritarian figure, that doctor. Question them. Don't just swallow hard and take it. Make sure you're not thinking about the doctor. Think about the person who is actually laying in that bed, having that dying experience. A question did come up. Is there a list of questions anywhere that you should ask your loved one?
I had neglected to mention another tool that is really wonderful. There's an advanced care planning document called the 5 Wishes. And it can be purchased online. It is a Power of Attorney Plus. It has many questions about what's important, what might be important to a person in terms of their care, their wishes, for end-of-life care. It's a beautiful document. It was actually created by a son who felt like he hadn't had that conversation with his mother enough. And the hospice I worked at was actually the first hospice in the United States that used that document. I would encourage you to take a look at it. If you're struggling with what to ask, this will help you. I've given it to couples who are struggling with how to talk to each other, and encourage them to use it as kind of homework, if you will, to help them in having the conversation about what's important. But it's a great tool.
You said you purchased, is it something you have to purchase?
It is. It's about $1 for an item. It's very inexpensive, but it's also available in like 24 languages, and it's now legal in all 50 states. So it's a transferable document. Just recently became legal in all 50 states, but it has to be purchased. A lot of hospices have it. We have it here. If somebody were to send me a note, I could send you one. But it's a great document, really, really.
So if anybody would like to get in contact with Nancy, you could go ahead and you can email me. I'll go ahead and I'll put my email address in there, so that you guys can have that. I always like to make sure that you get that, and I can go ahead and I can connect you with
Happy to help you with that. I used to give them out freely when I worked at my hospice because I thought it was that good a document.
That's wonderful. And the link is in the chat for all of you. I always encourage people to be able to just click on these links, and then while the meeting is still going on, because then post-meeting you'll have them all up on all your tabs and your whatever internet provider you have, and that way then you'll be able to access this stuff post-meeting, because unfortunately the chat does not transfer over into our YouTube channels. So on YouTube you do not get the chat links. But I will try to, because there's so many links for this, I will put them out and I'll put it on the Department on Aging's Ombudsman page for the Resident Family Support Council. I'll make a link page for that, for all these links that we've put into the chat so that people can access that there as well. It's 4:00 right now. And Steve, is there something you want to ask me?
Well, I wanted to add something because I remembered it as you were talking. Nancy, earlier you were talking about having a group of people who can discuss end of life wants and needs. And that is an incredibly powerful tool, especially when you have people who maybe don't have a person who can be the power of attorney. I know of a gentleman, he doesn't have any family. And the people that he's friends with are people, they're professional people that work with him. They cannot be his power of attorney because it's a conflict of interest. And so what he ended up doing is we got a power of attorney through a local guardianship office. And in his power of attorney, it has a list of, I think it's 4 or 5 individuals whom he trusts. And the power of attorney is the document directed to talk to these people in the event of something big happening to him. And I think it's a very powerful tool for some people. And it works well for him.
I think it's going to happen more and more. We have a growing number of people who live independently, who are single as they age. I've known people that have contracted with care managers to be their powers of attorney. But I think there's a lot of challenges that for people who don't live in, to be able to identify someone who can speak on their behalf. And I think that's going to be an ongoing challenge. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Really do.
So with that, I'm just going to end the recording, but we'll go ahead and we'll continue having a conversation. If you notice, I've put the poll up. I want to encourage people to participate in the poll. That's how we know what topics people really want to hear based upon how beneficial you really feel that this is, and also who's attending these meetings. It's very helpful information for us. So if you could please do that, that would be great. So I'm going to stop the recording now.